Tang Hao adjusted his glasses and stared at the monitor, the dim glow of the screen casting a ghostly light over his lab. He had spent countless sleepless nights here, experimenting, tweaking, and rewriting his code over and over again. Today, though, today was different. Today, he was going to change everything. The CRISPR technology that had taken the world by storm was now his tool. He had found a way to rewrite not just the code of the human genome, but to edit it, to enhance it. And the results, if his calculations were correct, were going to be monumental. Hawkeye vision, cheetah speed, and strength, he murmured to himself, as if saying the words aloud would make them real. It had been a risky experiment. He'd injected himself with the genetic sequences he'd altered, mixing the DNA of the animals he'd selected. The eagle's eyes, able to see with clarity that far outstripped any human's vision. The cheetah's legs, fast enough to run at unimaginable speeds. The ant's muscles, strong enough to carry loads far heavier than any human could manage. Tang Hao's fingers danced across the keyboard, inputting the final commands. He was shaking, but not from fear. He felt a rush of adrenaline that came from the thrill of being on the verge of greatness. As the program executed, a series of lights blinked across the control panel. A deep hum filled the air, like the sound of a powerful machine coming to life. The genetic sequence was in his bloodstream now. It was done. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange mixture of exhilaration and unease. Nothing immediate seemed to happen. His heartbeat was normal. His breathing, steady. Maybe it would take a few moments for the changes to take hold. Maybe he wouldn't even notice, but then, something strange happened. He felt it first in his eyes, a prickling sensation, like 1,000 pinpricks against the surface of his corneas. He squinted, as if trying to shake it off. But the sensation only grew stronger. His vision sharpened. Everything in the room, the scattered papers on his desk, the loose wires tangled on the floor, stood out with unnatural clarity. He gasped. He could see the fibers of his sweater, each individual strand of cotton, as if it were a microscopic view of the fibers themselves. The overhead light flickered once, and he could see the tiny sparks inside it, like a live wire teetering on the edge of a breakdown. He blinked, trying to adjust, but his eyes refused to settle. They were too sharp, too sensitive to the world around him. He had never imagined it would be like this. No way, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. But when he opened them again, the world was just as sharp. And in that moment, he could swear he saw the movement of a tiny fly in the corner of the room, too fast for a human to follow, but not for him. Without thinking, his body responded. He shot out of his chair, moving at lightning speed, and in a blur of motion, swatted the fly out of the air. It was almost like watching a video on fast forward. His hand came down like a hammer, his reflexes faster than his brain could even process. The fly was dead before it had a chance to escape. Holy crap, he whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. His heart raced with excitement. The cheetah's speed was real. The vision was real. And that was only the beginning. But before he could bask in his victory, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The room seemed to tilt sideways. His vision flickered for a moment, as if the enhanced sight was no longer just a tool but something that was demanding attention, forcing his mind to process more data than it could handle. He stumbled backward, feeling a wave of nausea. His muscles tensed, his body on high alert. It wasn't just the speed or the vision now. Something deeper, more primal, was stirring inside of him, an almost unbearable restlessness, as if every fiber of his being was vibrating with animal energy. Maybe I pushed it too far, he muttered, clutching the edge of his desk for support. His body was beginning to feel wrong, like he was losing touch with what it meant to be human. Tang Hao's thoughts scattered like a flock of birds as he staggered toward the door. He needed fresh air. He needed to calm down. He needed to think. Outside, the cool evening air hit him with a gust of relief. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But as he inhaled, his senses seemed to expand, like his nose was absorbing every single scent in the vicinity. The sharp tang of car exhaust. The faint perfume of a passerby. The damp earth underfoot, and then, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat, a movement in the distance. A cat, darting through an alleyway. No big deal, right? But to Tang Hao, it was like a signal flare going off in his mind. His muscles twitched involuntarily. His pulse quickened. It was pray God, no, he thought. This is insane. He could feel it, the urge to chase, to hunt. The same animal instincts he had always studied in his research, now pulsing through his veins like an uncontrollable fire. He was no longer just a scientist. He was something else. Something other. His breathing came in shallow gasps as he fought the impulse to run, to chase that cat down and catch it in a blur of speed and power. But the longer he resisted, the harder it became to ignore. It took all his willpower, but he eventually forced himself to walk away, clenching his fists so tightly that his nails bit into his palms. Back at his apartment, the chaos continued. The first few days passed in a haze of exhilaration and confusion. Tang Hao couldn't keep his mind focused on anything for too long. His senses were on overdrive. He could hear conversations from down the hall. He could see the flicker of a television screen through a wall. He could smell the faint aroma of someone's lunch hours before it even entered the building. And worst of all, he couldn't shake the feeling that his body was beginning to betray him. He was losing control. One afternoon, he decided to test his strength. He walked into his kitchen, picked up the refrigerator with ease, and tossed it across the room like it was a toy. The shock of it stunned him. He had never been this strong before. And yet, as he stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, a sense of terror gripped him. He was no longer himself. The things he had always believed to be true, that he was a rational, intelligent person, were fading, replaced by a gnawing, primal hunger that threatened to consume him. Later that night, Tang Hao sat in his apartment, staring at the reflection in his bathroom mirror. He was watching himself change, watching the man he once knew slip away. His eyes were glowing with an unnatural sharpness. His muscles rippled with strength that shouldn't have been possible. His senses were so heightened that it was almost unbearable. He was losing control. He had become something else entirely. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text message from his ex-girlfriend, Ling. Hey, I know we haven't talked in a while, but are you okay? I've been hearing some weird stuff about you. Let me know. Tang Hao stared at the message. He hadn't seen Ling in months. He wasn't sure why she was reaching out now, but one thing was clear: he didn't want her to see him like this. He didn't want anyone to see him like this. I'm becoming a monster, he thought bitterly. And if he didn't find a way to stop it, he'd never be Tang Hao again. Tang Hao's fingers hovered over the phone screen. His mind was a chaotic storm, swirling with the noise of his newfound abilities, the rising fear in his chest, and the creeping realization that his humanity was slipping away. His thoughts were jagged, fractured. I need to fix this. The message from Ling blinked at him. She had always been the one to keep him grounded. But how could he even begin to explain what had happened to him? How could he tell her he wasn't the man she once knew, that he was becoming something else? Something that didn't belong in the world of logic and reason he had built his life on. The phone buzzed again, this time a call. Ling's name flashed on the screen, her image clear in his mind, her long black hair, the faint curve of her smile, the way she used to tease him about his obsession with his work. That smile, now a distant memory, sent a pang through his chest that he didn't pick up. Instead, he tossed the phone across the room, watching it skitter across the floor. His body was trembling, his skin alive with a restless energy that he couldn't control. He pressed his palms to his face, trying to steady his breathing. But the hunger was there. A gnawing, insistent force at the back of his mind that it wasn't just the hunger for food, it was the hunger for power. For dominance. For the raw, primal thrill of movement. The urge to run, to hunt, to break free from the fragile human shell that was holding him back. He stood up, the floor creaking beneath his weight, and walked to the window. Outside, the city sprawled beneath him, a sea of lights and shadows, people moving through their daily routines. Ordinary. Simple. He had once been one of them. Now, he could hear everything: the muffled conversations on the street below, the rhythmic beat of a car's engine, the heartbeat of a woman walking her dog. He could feel the vibrations in the air, the pulse of the world itself. The smell of rain was in the air. The faintest trace of it, but it was there, sharp as if he could taste it. A noise behind him, a knock at the door. His heart thudded. He turned sharply, his reflexes kicking in before his brain had time to process. His muscles tensed, every fiber of his being on high alert. The instincts were taking over. Every ounce of his humanity screamed for him to ignore it. But there was a small part of him that still remembered who he was, the man who had, at one point, tried to live a normal life. A life of science. Of discovery. He took a deep breath and forced himself to the door. As he opened it, the familiar figure of Ling stood there, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay, Tang?" she asked, her voice soft, yet tinged with uncertainty. Her gaze flickered nervously to his eyes, and then to his clenched fists. "I've been trying to reach you." He opened his mouth to speak but found that his voice was trapped somewhere between words and growls. The hunger inside him was suddenly louder, louder than her voice, louder than anything else. He had to say something. He had to. "Ling," he finally managed, his voice strained, almost foreign to him. "You shouldn't have come. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to explain myself." Her brows furrowed, her lips parted in confusion. "You're acting weird, Tang. You're not yourself. What's going on? This isn't like you." He forced himself to take a step back, hoping the distance would help. "You don't understand. I've changed. Something's happened to me. Something that I can't stop." She looked at him, concern now mixing with fear. She took a tentative step inside. "I don't know what you mean. But you've always been a little obsessive about your work, you know? Maybe it's just stress or something." "No," he said, his voice darkening as his body seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. "It's more than stress. It's like my body is being taken over by something else. I don't feel like myself anymore. I'm losing control." He saw her open her mouth to speak, but he didn't wait for her response. He couldn't. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and every inch of him screamed for release. He turned sharply, pacing the floor, his mind a tangled mess of frustration and desperation. He could feel the transformation happening more strongly than ever. His body was no longer his own. The power was coursing through his veins, pushing him toward something animal, something primal. "I can't do this. Not with her here." He needed to get away. He had to get to the lab. It was the only place where he might be able to undo what he had done, to try to reverse the process before it was too late. "Ling," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of regret and fear, "you need to leave. Please. I don't want to hurt you." "Stop," she said, her voice firm. "I don't care what's going on. I'm not going to let you just push me away. I'm here for you, Tang. I can help." But as she moved closer to him, her hand reaching out as if to comfort him, something in Tang Hao snapped. That he caught her wrist, his grip tight, the strength in his hand enough to make her wince. "No, you don't understand. You don't get it." His voice cracked as he fought to control the wild surge of animal instinct. He pulled her closer, the pull of his enhanced strength making it impossible for her to break free. The hunger surged again. It clawed at his insides, urging him to act. To take what he wanted. His vision blurred. He saw her as more than just a person now. He saw her as prey, just like that cat from earlier. His muscles twitched. His eyes were wide, pupils dilating as the animal inside of him stretched out, waiting for permission to take control. Her breath hitched. Tang, what's happening to you? He couldn't breathe. He could only hear the rush of blood pounding in his ears. Could only feel the heat in his chest as the animal within him pushed against every last shred of his humanity. Please, Tang. Her voice wavered, but the words barely reached him. The world had become too sharp, too overpowering. His brain screamed at him to stop, to regain control. But the animal instincts clawed harder than ever. Then, just as the last vestiges of his self-control started to crack, there was a snap. The door swung open behind her. A figure stepped into the room, dark and tall, with an air of authority that stilled the moment. Tang Hao's animal instincts flared, every sense tingling. But his mind barely registered the person entering. The man's voice cut through the chaos. Let her go, Tang. Tang's vision cleared for a moment, and he realized who it was. Dr. Li, he gasped, the recognition pushing through the fog in his mind. What are you doing here? Fixing your mistake, Dr. Li said, his eyes cold as he sized up the situation. You didn't think you could just tamper with your DNA and walk away, did you? The recognition of Dr. Li's voice pierced through the fog of Tang Hao's mind like a knife. The man standing in the doorway wasn't just any colleague, he was Tang's mentor, someone who had cautioned him for years about the dangers of unchecked ambition. He had warned him, had pleaded with him to proceed slowly, to think about the risks. Tang's hand tightened on Ling's wrist involuntarily, his knuckles white, his muscles trembling. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat driving him further into a frenzy of confusion and animal instinct. His eyes darted toward Dr. Li, but the world around him seemed too loud, too fast. He couldn't focus. He couldn't think. The urge to flee, to run, to hunt, was overwhelming. Ling's breath was shallow, her eyes wide with fear, and the pulse of Tang's heartbeat drowned out all other sounds. He was spiraling out of control. He could feel it. Dr. Li's voice sliced through the noise, firm, unyielding. I said, let her go, Tang. There was no hesitation, no fear in his tone. Just authority. The words seemed to reach through the haze, a lifeline in the swirling chaos of Tang's mind. He blinked. Once. Twice. His grip on Ling loosened just enough for her to pull away, stumbling backward toward the door. Her eyes never left him, wide with a mixture of fear and concern. She hadn't run. She hadn't screamed. She was still trying to help him. That realization hit Tang like a shockwave. He didn't want to hurt her. He didn't want to hurt anyone. But something inside of him was changing, shifting, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it at bay. He couldn't let it consume him. He took a step back, breathing heavily, fighting the storm inside him. But Dr. Li didn't move, didn't back down. He stood his ground, his gaze steady, as if he had prepared for this moment long before. You're losing yourself, Tang, Dr. Li said, his voice softer now, but no less forceful. And if you don't stop this, it's only going to get worse. You've crossed a line. You don't have to let it be the end. You can still fix this. But you have to come with me. Now. Tang's chest heaved as the hunger, the animal need, twisted inside of him. He wanted to scream, to run, to tear through the walls of his apartment, but his legs felt like they were glued to the floor. His fingers clenched, released, then clenched again. Every part of him screamed for release, but a part of his mind, the part that had once been rational, once been human, held on to the last threads of control. Fix it, he rasped, his voice low, guttural. How? You think you can just undo this? His breath was ragged now, every word coming out in sharp, clipped bursts. You don't know what it's like. It's taking over. I can't, you can, Dr. Li interrupted, taking a single step closer. I've seen what you've done. I know you, Tang. And I know you're not beyond saving. But you have to trust me. You have to come with me, and we'll reverse the process together. The words seemed to settle over Tang like a balm, a momentary relief from the chaotic storm swirling inside him. He could fix this. It wasn't too late. But a cold, gnawing fear settled in his stomach. If he let go of the animal instinct, if he tried to walk away from the power he'd gained, would he still be Tang Hao? Would he be anything at all? What if it was too late? What if the transformation was already too far gone? Dr. Li's eyes flickered to Ling, still standing by the door, trembling, but still watching him with an expression of concern. She hadn't left. She was still there. She hadn't given up on him, despite everything he'd done. He wanted to reach for her, to tell her he was sorry, but his body refused to obey him. His eyes darted back to Dr. Li, his mind still racing. Could he trust him? Could he even trust himself anymore? I can't, Tang started to say, his voice faltering. But then the world shifted again, his vision blurring, the hunger rising up to choke his words. And just like that, the animal instinct overwhelmed him once more. His pupils dilated, the darkness within him surging to the surface. His mind screamed, trying to fight it, but his body responded without his command. He could feel the strength in his legs, the speed in his veins. His senses flooded with the sense of everything around him, the air, the sweat on Ling's skin, the faint traces of blood in the room. The primal urge surged inside of him, and before he even realized what was happening, his body was in motion. He was moving faster than he had ever moved before. Ling gasped, stepping back in fear, but Tang barely registered her presence. All he could hear now was the sound of his own heartbeat, the thudding pulse of something wild and untamed. He could hear Dr. Li shouting something, but the words didn't reach him. All that mattered was the chase. The hunger. The need to escape, to release the animal inside of him. And then, just as he was about to break free, to run, something stopped him. A searing pain shot through his side. It wasn't a physical pain, but a mental one. A force so strong, it yanked him back from the edge of the abyss. His body jerked as if shocked by an electric current, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he heard his own voice again. No. The word was a raw gasp, torn from his throat as if he was fighting for control. He stumbled back, his vision flickering, and for a moment, everything paused. The hunger, the rush, the urge to flee, it all stalled, just for a second. His mind cleared enough to recognize the truth. He had to stop. Now, the thought of running, of losing himself entirely, made his stomach churn. He had worked so hard to build something, to be something. He had to reclaim it. No matter the cost. He dropped to his knees, his breath ragged, his head pounding, and then, with all the strength he could muster, he forced himself to look up at Dr. Li. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Please. Help me. Dr. Li's face softened. For the first time, there was no judgment in his eyes, just understanding. And something that, for a brief moment, felt like hope. We'll fix this, Tang, he said, moving closer, his voice calm but firm. We'll fix it. Together. The words, simple as they were, felt like a lifeline. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Tang Hao allowed himself to believe that there was a chance. A chance to be human again. But the journey ahead would not be easy. The battle within him, between the man he had been and the monster he was becoming, was far from over. And every step toward redemption would be a struggle, a constant fight to hold on to the last scraps of what made him Tang Hao. The road ahead was uncertain. But as he looked into Dr. Li's eyes, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone.